There's a word in the Veth language that has no direct translation. It is spoken only once in formal ceremony. At the moment a war is declared lost. Not surrendered. Lost. There's a difference in Veth culture, and the difference matters enormously. Surrender implies choice. Loss implies something else entirely. It implies that the enemy was not something you can negotiate with. Not something that understood flags, or terms, or the concept of mercy as a transaction. The word is Kaeldrath, roughly, and this is the best any human linguist has managed. It means the moment you understand the thing hunting you is never afraid of you to begin with. The Veth said it for the first time in recorded history during the Second Spiral Collapse, when the Dravari swarm consumed 4 of their core systems in 11 days. They said it again when the Hounds of Miros burned their generation ships at the edge of the Outer Reach. They built monuments to those moments. They made them holy. There was a kind of comfort the Veth believed in naming the exact second you stopped matching. They said a third time when they first detected the signal from the blue-green world near the edge of the Orion Spur. Not because the signal was threatening, because it wasn't. It was chaotic, layered, full of contradictions. War poetry broadcast on the same frequency as children's music. Mathematical proofs tangled up with what their analysts eventually identified as sports statistics. Religious hymns running parallel to what appear to be advertisements for a product called a cheeseburger. The Veth High Council reviewed the signal for 6 years before issuing their formal assessment. The assessment read, in its entirety, *, we do not understand what this is. We recommend observation at maximum safe distance. We recommend against contact. We recommend against engagement. We recommend, above all, that whatever this is, we do not allow it to notice us. * They were too late. Humanity had already noticed everything. And what nobody, not the Veth, not the 12 species galactic concordat, not the Dravari, not the ancient machine minds of the silence, what nobody understood yet was the thing that made humans the single most dangerous organism the galaxy had ever produced. It wasn't their technology. It was primitive, comparatively. It wasn't their numbers, manageable by galactic standards. It wasn't even their violence, though that would become legendary soon enough. It was this. Humans were the only species in 400,000 years of recorded galactic history that had looked at total annihilation, looked directly at it, eye to eye, with full comprehension of the odds, and felt something that their own neurologists still cannot fully explain. They felt interested, not brave. Brave implies the presence of fear, managed. This was different. This was a species that had spent 200,000 years at the bottom of a food chain, getting eaten, getting sick, getting frozen and starved and struck by lightning and swallowed by the sea, and instead of evolving away from danger, had evolved something far stranger. They had evolved the need to walk toward it. The Veth had a word for the moment you realized the thing hunting you is never afraid. They did not have a word for what it feels like when the thing you were hunting stands up, turns around, and smiles. They would need one soon. This is the story of how humanity went from myth to command. It starts like most human things with a problem nobody thought could be solved, and one person too stubborn to agree. Commander Sarah Voss had been awake for 31 hours when the war finally came to find her. She was standing in the secondary observation bay of the Union Meridian, not because she had been ordered there, not because anything useful was happening in the secondary observation bay at 0300 ship time, but because the primary bridge was full of people doing the reasonable thing, which was panicking quietly and professionally, and Sarah had never found panic useful. She had found that the best thing to do when everything was about to go wrong was to stand somewhere with a window and look at the stars for a while and try to remember that the universe was very old and very large and had survived worse than whatever was currently trying to kill her. The problem, tonight, was that she wasn't entirely sure that was still true. The Dravari fleet had dropped out of fold space at 0130. 12 capital ships, 47 strike cruisers, an escort screen so dense the sensor array had initially misread it as an asteroid field and tagged it for geological survey. Lieutenant Okafor had been the one to catch the error, and she had done so by noticing that asteroid fields generally did not emit weapons lock signals. Okafor was sharp. Sarah had put a commendation in her file the same morning the universe had decided to end. The Meridian had 6 guns that could genuinely threaten a Dravari capital ship, assuming all 6 hit the same spot, in sequence, in under 4 seconds, which was not the kind of sequence that happened in real combat. It had 300 crew, It had a full drive that needed another 8 hours to recharge. And it had, sitting in its secondary observation bay, one Commander Sarah Voss, 31 hours awake, coffee going cold in her hand, staring at the stars. She was 29 years old. She had joined the United Earth Navy at 17, during the first contact aftermath, when Earth's governments were still pretending that the discovery of alien life was a diplomatic event rather than a military one. She had watched the diplomats try. She respected the attempt. She understood that the Veth, the Concordat species, even some of the Dravari fringe worlds, were capable of conversation, treaty, and the basic exchange of information without shooting. She had read all the contact reports. She had also read the reports they didn't put in the official files. The ones that detailed what the Dravari had done to the Veth colony at Tessara Point. The ones that analyzed the wreckage of the Concordat's third peacekeeping fleet, which had gone to negotiate and come back as debris spread over approximately 600,000 kilometers of open space. The ones that contained, buried in Appendix C of a report marked Classification Omega, a single sentence that had changed the direction of her entire life. All evidence suggests the Dravari do not distinguish between military and civilian targets because they do not recognize the category distinction. Asterisk, she had read that at 19. She had thought about it for 10 years. The Dravari did not think humans were warriors. They had reviewed Earth's detection from a distance, assessed the technological index, cross-referenced it with their conquest database, and categorized humanity as a grade 3 harvest civilization. In Dravari military taxonomy, that meant sufficient biological mass to be useful, insufficient military capacity to be a threat, optimal timeline for resource extraction approximately 6 to 8 of their cycles, which worked out to roughly 40 to 50 Earth years. They were not here tonight to fight. They were here to begin the paperwork. Sarah drank the cold coffee. Behind her, the door opened, and Lieutenant Commander Dresh stepped in. Dresh was Veth, one of 43 non-human crew aboard the Meridian, part of the joint integration program that had been theoretically harmonious and practically a constant low-grade diplomatic negotiation. He was tall, gray-skinned, four-armed, and currently wearing an expression that Sarah had learned over 3 years of working together. Meant he had bad news he was trying to find a gentle way to deliver. She saved him the trouble. 12 capitals, she said. 14, Dresh said. 2 were running dark. They came up on sensors 17 seconds ago. How long until they're in range? Of us. He paused. 42 minutes. Of the colony on Voss 4. Another pause, longer. 28. Sarah looked at the stars. Voss 4, named after her father's survey mission 20 years ago. 14,000 colonists. Mostly agricultural. No significant military installation, which was why nobody had thought to put a real defensive fleet there, which was why there was currently one undergun patrol cruiser standing between 14,000 people and 14 Dravari capital ships. Fleet command response, she said. Acknowledged our distress signal 40 minutes ago. Fastest available response time is 6 hours. Fold-capable ships. 3. All in mid-fold. Can't abort the transit. 6 hours. She had 28 minutes before the first Dravari ship came into firing range of a colony that had no shields worth a name. She had 42 minutes before they came into range of her. The math did not require a specialist. The crew, she said. Aware. Frightened. Functional. Dresh paused. Lieutenant Okafor has been running firing solutions for the last hour. She has found 17 scenarios under which we could damage a Dravari capital ship significantly enough to slow its approach. 17. Sarah turned from the window. How many of those scenarios end with us intact? Dresh was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be its own kind of answer. None that she has found acceptable to share with me, he said, though she has been working on an 18th. Sarah looked at him. Really looked. The Veth had better night vision than humans. Their pupils expanded to full black in low light, which most of the human crew found unsettling. Dresh had stopped apologizing for it. She had told him not to. His eyes right now were the full, unnerving black of something that had long ago made its peace with the dark. You fought in the Tessara campaign, she said. I survived it, he said, which was not the same thing, and they both knew it. What did the Dravari do when they hit your colony defense ships? They ignored them, Dresh said, until they were finished with their primary target. Then they came back. He let a breath out, slow and controlled. The Veth have a doctrine for this situation, Commander. We call it the honored retreat. The calculation is simple. A ship that survives can fight again. A ship that does not cannot. And how many times did the honored retreat save a colony? He did not answer. She turned back to the window. Here was the thing about Sarah Voss that her psych evaluations have been trying to articulate for 12 years without ever quite landing on the right language. She was not reckless. Reckless implied she didn't see the danger. She saw it fine. She saw it in precise, uncomfortable detail. She saw the 14 capital ships. She saw the math. She saw the odds laid out like a losing hand of cards. Every card face up, nothing hidden. She saw all of it. She just didn't experience it the way the psych evaluators expected. There was no spike of cortisol, no narrowing of focus into pure survival mode tunnel vision. There was something else instead, something that felt, if she was honest with herself, almost like the feeling she got when a problem was interesting. Not the outcome, not the dying. That part she was not interested in, but the puzzle of it, the pure mechanical puzzle of, here is a situation that everyone says is impossible. Here is the math that proves it. Now, what did everyone miss? She had been turning the math over in her head for the last hour. Not the obvious math, not the guns and shields and full drive recharge time. The other math, the Dravari math. Dresh, she said. Commander, the Dravari categorized us as grade 3 harvest. What does that mean for their engagement doctrine specifically? Dresh thought about it. Low resistance protocol. They use the minimum force necessary to suppress organized response. Then, shift to resource extraction mode. They do not. He stopped. Sarah looked at him. He was working through the same thing she was. She could see it happening, that vertical line appearing between his brow ridges that meant he was computing something that didn't fit. They do not, he said slowly, update their target classification mid-engagement. Their fleet doctrine is built around efficiency. Reclassification requires a formal reassessment process that takes how long? Standard is 12 cycles. Roughly 4 Earth hours. Sarah felt something click into place the way a lock opens. Not dramatically, just precisely. So if we respond in a way that exceeds their grade 3 parameters, she said, they don't reclassify us in real time. They keep running grade 3 protocol against what is actually a higher threat category. They're working off the wrong playbook. For approximately 4 hours, yes. Dresh's voice had changed. It was doing something she had only heard from him twice before. A Veth thing. A quality of vibration below the spoken words that their species used to signal what humans would call grave attention. But Commander, for that to work, for them to be forced into a reclassification event, we would need to inflict damage so far outside their expected parameters for a grade 3 civilization that their automated assessment system flags the anomaly. We would need to hit them in a way they did not believe we could. Yes, Sarah said. We have 6 guns. We have 6 guns, she agreed. They have 14 capital ships. 14, she confirmed. Dresh was quiet. And then, what are you planning to do with 6 guns that 14 capital ships will find genuinely surprising? She was already walking toward the door. Something they haven't cataloged yet, she said. The bridge of the Meridian was all controlled noise when she stepped in. Voices calling out distance updates, weapons charging status, the low-frequency hum of a ship that had moved from standby to combat readiness. 260-something years of combined military experience in that room. And every face turned toward her with the same expression. Not panic. Not anymore. Waiting. She looked at Okafor first. Tell me about the 18th scenario. Okafor was 24. She had the specific stillness of someone who had been terrified for the last hour and had run all the way through terror and out the other side into something colder and more useful. She pulled up her display without a word. The 18th scenario was insane. It was also, Sarah thought, the only thing in the room that had a chance of working. The Dravari capital ships were running in a standard harvest approach formation, a wide crescent meant to sweep defensive positions and funnel civilian traffic toward collection points. It was efficient. It was effective. It had worked for the Dravari in hundreds of engagements across 400 years of recorded conquest. It was also built entirely around the assumption that whoever they were facing would behave predictably. Okafor's 18th scenario required the Meridian to do something no ship her size had ever done in combat. Fly directly toward the formation. Not at an angle. Not in an evasive pattern. Straight in, full thrust, directly at the center of the crescent. The Dravari engagement doctrine for Grade 3 encounters had a specific automated response to any ship approaching their formation. It was designed to deal with panicked civilian craft trying to flee, which occasionally flew erratically toward the fleet. The automated system would hold fire on a non-combat profile approach for 8 seconds while it classified the contact. 8 seconds was not long. 8 seconds was, however, exactly long enough for the Meridian to close to a range where their 6 guns could fire at a concentration of Dravari ships that would otherwise be unreachable, and, more importantly, to fire in a sequence Okafor had calculated based on the Dravari ship's specific shield harmonics, which rotated on a cycle the Dravari had been using for 60 years without changing because no enemy had ever survived long enough to map the rotation. Humanity had had first contact with Dravari shield technology for 8 years. Okafor had been mapping the rotation for 4. If the first 3 shots land in the right sequence, Okafor said, and her voice was flat and precise as a blade, we collapse shields on 2 capital ships simultaneously. Not damage them. Collapse. Then, shots 4 through 6, gut them, Sarah said. 2 capital ships, yes. The room was very quiet. 12 left. Still 12. The Meridian would be an effective weapons range of 12 Dravari capital ships, while they processed the fact that 2 of their own had just been gutted by a vessel their doctrine said couldn't do it. In those 4 hours of reclassification, in that window of processing time, the rest of the colony fleet could scramble. Earth's response ships could fold closer. The colony could begin evacuation. 14,000 people. 12 ships that still wanted to kill her. 8 seconds to get into range. Sarah looked at Okafor's 18th scenario for exactly 5 seconds. All right, she said. Let's show them something they haven't seen before. Dresh, beside her, made a sound she had never heard from him. Low. Resonant. She looked at him. His 4 hands were moving in a configuration she had seen in Veth ceremonial footage, specifically in footage of warriors before significant battles. His eyes were black and full of stars. In Veth, she said, is there a word for what you feel when something you thought was impossible starts to seem possible? He thought about it seriously. Not exactly, he said. The closest would be a word we use for the moment a storm turns. He paused. We say it's the moment the weather decides. Sarah turned to face the bridge. All stations, she said. Full thrust. Direct approach. We're going in. And the Meridian went in. No evasive pattern. No question. No epaligi. Straight at the heart of 14 ships that had never, in 400 years of conquest, been afraid of anything they were hunting. The weather decided. The Dravari automated system saw the incoming contact, classified it, ran the parameters, held fire for 8 seconds, exactly as designed, because nothing in its database told it to be afraid of this. The 8 seconds ended. By then, the Meridian's first shot was already traveling at 94% of light speed toward shield harmonic that Okafor had spent 4 years learning to break. The galaxy, in this moment, did not yet know what was beginning. But the Dravari capital ship, Conquest Absolute, pride of the 3rd Harvest Fleet, veteran of 600 engagements, destroyer of 32 civilizations, was about to find out. The shot hit. The shield collapsed. The second shot was already on the way. The recording lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Fleet Admiral Greth of the Dravari 13th Conquest Division watched it 11 times before he spoke. His staff stood around the command table in silence, which was not unusual. His staff was silent most of the time because Greth had a habit of removing officers who offered commentary before he requested it. His staff had learned. Silence was safe. Silence meant you were still standing in the same room tomorrow. After the 11th viewing, Greth said, "Show me the ship classification again." The technical officer, young, ridge-crested, careful, pulled up the designation file. Human Patrol Cruiser. UANA Designation Meridian. Class, Light Escort. Standard Armament. 6 forward guns, mid-range, grade 3 compatible. Shield capacity. Insufficient for sustained engagement against capital class. The officer paused. It is by every metric we have, a ship that should not have been able to do this. The recording showed the 2 capital ships. The flagship Conquest Absolute and the Teeth of the Void, 2 of the finest ships in the 13th Division. Crewed by 4,300 Dravari in total, veterans, specialists, the pride of the Conquest Fleet. Ships that had reduced civilizations to resource maps. Ships that had never, in the combined memory of everyone standing in this room, lost their shields to anything short of an opposing capital vessel running coordinated fire patterns. The recording showed both of them. Shields gone, core systems failing, the specific dark bloom of catastrophic internal detonation that anyone who had served on Dravari capital ships recognized and had nightmares about gone. In 11 seconds of the human vessel's engagement run, those 11 seconds were available for replay from multiple angles because the remaining 12 fleet ships had all been recording for after-action report, and Greth had watched all 12 angles 11 times now, and the answer was always the same. Those 2 ships were gone. The human patrol cruiser, 1 ship, 6 guns, grade 3 classification, had done it, and then it had done something Greth found, professionally speaking, almost more disturbing than the ships it had killed. It had stopped firing. It had held position, in range of the remaining 12 ships, in range of everything. Shields heavily degraded by return fire. 1 engine running at partial capacity. It had sat there crippled and still alive, and broadcast on standard Dravari military channels a message that the translation system had initially flagged as corrupted because the content was so outside the expected parameters of a grade 3 civilization's communication profile that the system thought it was noise. It was not noise. The message, cleaned up and translated, read, "This is Commander Sarah Voss of the United Earth Navy. You have entered sovereign human space. You have engaged human forces. You have sustained loss. I want you to think carefully about what happened in the last 11 seconds. I want you to think about what a full human fleet response looks like if you're still here when it arrives. You have 1 hour to make a decision that you will either make now, or you will not be making decisions at all. This is a courtesy. We do not have to extend courtesies. We are choosing to. The choice you make in the next hour will determine which version of this story gets told." Greth read the message again. He was 312 years old, by human reckoning, old enough to have personally overseen the absorption of 11 civilizations, old enough to have heard every variation of a losing species try to negotiate from a position of nothing. Desperation had a particular flavor in interstellar communication. You could recognize it in the compression of the transmission, the urgency of the phrasing, the way species on the edge of extinction always tried to sound larger than they were. This message did not taste like desperation. It tasted like something he had encountered very rarely in 3 centuries of conquest. It tasted like someone who genuinely believed they had the upper hand. He turned to his signals officer. "Give me everything on the United Earth Navy. Full database pull. I want it annotated and cross-referenced with our conquest records. We have limited data on human military capacity," the signals officer said carefully. "Their emergence into galactic contact is recent. Our assessment on file is grade 3. I know what our assessment says." Greth's voice was flat. "I also know what grade 3 ships are supposed to do when they engage a 13th Division Harvest Fleet. Update the assessment. I want our current best estimate on human military assets within fold response distance of this system." The answer came back in 6 minutes. The answer was not good. Not because the number was large. It was not large. Humanity had been in space for a blink of galactic time. They had ships, but not many. They had weapons, but not the most advanced. They had territory, but not vast. By any rational accounting, they were still in the early, awkward stage of becoming a galactic species. They were still finding their feet. The problem was not the number. The problem was the rate. The human military build rate, the pace at which they were constructing ships, training crews, developing weapons technology, was unlike anything in the Dravari conquest database. Every species they had absorbed had, at the moment of first contact, a military development rate that either held steady or declined as conquest pressure increased. That was expected behavior. Fear slows innovation. Trauma contracts resources. Civilizations facing extinction tend to get smaller, not larger, because the threat overwhelms the infrastructure needed to respond. Humanity's military development rate, in the years since first contact with galactic civilization, had increased by 700%. Not grown, not expanded. 700% increase. And it had accelerated every time a Dravari probe or survey ship had come within detection range of human space. Every encounter with galactic threat had not frightened them into contraction. It had apparently functioned as the analyst who wrote the report had struggled to find the right word and had eventually landed on stimulus. Every threat had been a stimulus that made them build faster, think harder, develop more aggressively. The Veth had a phenomenon they called the storm turn, the moment weather changed direction. Greth was too old and too practical for philosophical language. What he saw in the analyst report was something his engineers would call a positive feedback loop, running in the wrong direction for the perspective of everyone who wasn't human. You threaten them, they grow. You grow, they accelerate. You accelerate, they do something you didn't think they could do to two of your capital ships with 6 guns and a patrol cruiser. He sat with this information for a long time. He had left the Meridian alive during the processing window, standard protocol, while the reclassification ran. But the window was closing. In 40 minutes, the formal reclassification would complete. The automated systems would update the engagement profile, and then the decision would have to be made: press the harvest operation as planned, or his second-in-command, Sub-Admiral Veth, coincidental name, no relation to the species, spoke from the far end of the table. The remaining 12 ships have full engagement capacity. The human vessel is damaged. We can complete the harvest operation within original timeline parameters if we move in the next 20 minutes. Greth looked at him. We have a message on file, Greth said, from a human commander with 6 guns who just ended 2 of my capital ships in 11 seconds. The message said, think about what a full fleet response looks like. He paused. You're suggesting I finish the harvest operation. You're suggesting I proceed as if the last 11 seconds didn't happen. Sub-Admiral Veth said nothing. That message is not a bluff, Greth said. Grade 3 civilization's bluff. What I just watched is not a grade 3 civilization. He looked back at the recording, frozen now on the image of the Meridian. One small ship, sitting still in space, surrounded by 12 ships that should have destroyed it, and hadn't yet. The Veth used to say that the most dangerous moment in any war was the moment before you understood what you were fighting. He stood. Signal the fleet. We are pulling back to reassessment range. Send the reclassification request to command on standard encrypted, and compose a formal response to Commander Saravos. Sub-Admiral Veth stared at him. We are retreating. We are conducting a tactical reassessment, Greth said, in the tone that reminded everyone in the room why his staff stayed silent. There is a difference. The difference is the decision you survive to make tomorrow. He moved toward the communication station. Compose the message. Acknowledged. Reassessment initiated. Further engagement suspended pending command review. We will return. He stopped. Added one line. We will be better prepared next time. He meant it as a warning. 40 light years away, in the Veth Council chambers of the Concordat Assembly, a diplomat named First Voice Ron was asleep when the emergency signal reached her desk. She was awake 10 seconds after the alert tone sounded. Veth could shift from full sleep to full cognitive function in under 12 seconds, a survival trait from their pre-technological period, and she read the first report in the gray dawn light of her quarters. She read it twice. Then, she contacted her assistant. Give me everything we have on the Meridian engagement, and get me a direct line to the Human Admirals Council. She paused. And get me a translation consult on the human concept. She checked the transcription. Courtesy. Her assistant asked why specifically. Because Commander Voss offered the Dravaria courtesy, and I need to understand exactly what kind of mind offers an enemy fleet a courtesy when it's sitting damaged and surrounded. She pulled up the image of the Meridian. Small ship. Very small, in the frame of 12 capital ships behind it. The Veth have been studying humans for 9 years. I want every cultural analysis report on what drives their decision-making under threat. All of it. The assistant compiled. It took 3 hours. First Voice Ron read through 700 pages of accumulated xenoanthropological observation, intelligence assessment, behavioral modeling, and the occasional startled field report from Veth observers embedded in human-adjacent space. 3 findings recurred across every document with a frequency that the analytical system had flagged as statistically significant. First, humans experience danger as a driver of innovation rather than a suppressant at rates that exceeded any recorded species in galactic history. Second, humans had an unusual relationship with the concept of losing. Most species, when facing a losing scenario, accepted the loss and adjusted behavior accordingly. Humans had produced, over the span of their documented history, an extraordinary number of cases in which a losing party had, against all rational calculation, refused to accept the loss and have found a different route to a different outcome. The analytical model for this behavior kept producing errors because the model was built on rational actor assumptions, and humans were not, in situations of high stakes, particularly rational actors. Third, and this was the one Ron came back to, the one that sat at the base of her mind and wouldn't move, humans were the only species in the database that routinely won conflicts not by being superior, but by being willing to pay a cost the other party had not budgeted for. The Dravari had not budgeted for 2 capital ships. They had not budgeted for it, because nothing in Grade 3 should have been able to take them. The math said no. The doctrine said no. 3 centuries of conquest said no. Commander Voss had apparently not received the memo. Ron set down the reports and looked out her window at the slow-turning light of the Concordat hub station. She had been a diplomat for 40 years. She had seen species rise and fall in galactic regard, had watched civilizations negotiate their way out of extinction and others negotiate their way into it. She had a good instinct for the shape of things, for the moment of balance was shifting, the moment of power arrangement was turning inside out. She felt it now. Something was turning. She contacted the Human Admirals Council. Admiral Marcus Webb answered on the second tone. He was 61 years old, broad-faced, white-haired, with the deep eye lines of someone who had been up since before First Voice Ron's emergency alert sounded. He already knew. Of course he already knew. First Voice, he said. I assume you've seen the Meridian report. I have. She composed herself. I'm calling, Admiral, because in 40 years of diplomacy, I have rarely been in the position of reaching out to a species to say, formally and on record, that what I just witnessed requires a formal reassessment of the Concordat's understanding of human military capacity. Webb looked at her steadily. Because of what one ship did. Because of what one ship did, she confirmed, and because of what it tells us about the rest of them. She paused. Commander Voss offered the Dravari a courtesy. A warning. She gave them an hour to withdraw. She did, Webb said. What? Ron said. By every military calculation, she was in a position where finishing the engagement or holding position for support would have been the tactically appropriate choice. Why offer them a way out? Webb was quiet for a moment. Then, because she wasn't trying to win a battle, First Voice. She was trying to win a war. Those are different things. A battle you win by destroying the enemy. A war you sometimes win by showing the enemy exactly enough of what you are, just enough that they go back and think hard and maybe make different choices next time. He folded his hands. She gave them the courtesy because she wanted them to leave carrying a very specific memory of what they'd seen. She wanted that memory to do the work so the next engagement doesn't have to. Ron processed this. And if they come back with a larger fleet? Then we'll be ready, Webb said in a tone that was perfectly calm and somehow the most unsettling thing she had heard all day. You say that with considerable confidence for a species that, by galactic standards, has been in space for 11 years, 3 months, and about 16 days, Webb said. We know. We're new here. The corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. We're learning fast. Ron looked at him. She had been studying humans for 9 years. She had read 700 pages of analysis this morning alone. She had the accumulated xenoanthropological weight of Veth observation behind every conclusion she drew, and she still could not fully model what she was looking at. The Dravari were going back to their command structure to ask for a reclassification. The Veth were going back to their archives to rewrite their assessment. Humanity, 11 years into galactic contact, was sitting in a damaged patrol cruiser in the middle of a system they just defended with 6 guns, and one person who had looked at 14 capital ships and thought, interesting. The Concordat Assembly, the oldest diplomatic body in the known galaxy, would hold an emergency session the following week. The agenda item, listed first and flagged urgent, read simply, reassessment, human military classification, grade 3 status under review. Asterisk, it was the first time in the Assembly's recorded history that a species had been reclassified upward in the middle of an active engagement. It would not be the last time humanity did something the records said couldn't happen. But nobody knew that yet. In the secondary observation bay of the Meridian, shields burned down to 30%. One engine limping, coffee machine inexplicably still functional. Commander Sarah Voss stood at the window and looked at the stars. The Dravari fleet was withdrawing. Okafor appeared in the doorway. Fleet response ships are 40 minutes out. We're getting a commendation signal from Admiral Webb. Noted, Sarah said. Also a contact request from First Voice Ron of the Veth Concordat seat. Okafor paused. She wants to talk. Noted, Sarah said again. And Okafor said, with the particular tone of someone delivering news that belongs to a different category than the other news, we have 12 Dravari capital ships on long-range scan, pulling to reassessment range. They're not leaving. They're watching. Sarah looked at the retreating formation on the window's reflected display. Good, she said. Good. Let them watch. She drank what was left of her coffee. Let them go back and explain what they saw. Let them try to fit us in a box that works. She set down the mug. They're going to need a bigger box. Okafor was quiet for a second. You knew this would happen. Okafor said. You knew they'd retreat. Sarah thought about this honestly. I knew, she said, that they'd never seen anything like us. And I knew that things you've never seen before make you careful. Careful buys time. She turned from the window. Time is what 14,000 people on Vosfor needed. She walked toward the door. Ma'am, Okafor said. So I stopped. That was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen, Okafor said, and I've been in 3 combat engagements. Yeah, Sarah said. Were you scared? Sarah considered the question. I was, she said, interested. She left. The Dravari watched. The galaxy turned. Somewhere in a Concordat archive, a clerk was updating the human classification file. The old designation, Grade 3, Harvest Civilization, was being retired. The new designation was still being argued over. Nobody could agree on the right word. One young Veth analyst, working late, wrote in her personal notes a word she'd invented herself. She wrote it in the margin next to the sensor recording of the Meridian flying straight into a formation of 14 capital ships. The word was Kelvrith, an invented compound, which Veth grammarians would have objected to. But she wrote anyway. It meant, roughly, the thing that was prey, that forgot. The Galactic Concordat had been convening emergency sessions for 400,000 years. They had procedures for everything. Cascading existential threats, species extinction events, stellar phenomena that threatened inhabited systems, plague vectors crossing 6 civilizations simultaneously. The Concordat had protocols and procedures and working groups and subcommittees with very long names for all of it. They were very good at managing crises in an orderly way. Order was the Concordat's primary product, and they exported it aggressively to every corner of the mapped galaxy. What they did not have a protocol for was this. What they did not have a working group for was the question of what to do when a Grade 3 civilization, a new species, barely 11 years in open space, still figuring out the navigation calibrations for their fold drives, had just demonstrated that their basic tactical thinking was not only sophisticated enough to counter a Dravari capital fleet, but sophisticated enough to do it in a way that caused the Dravari to retreat voluntarily, which the Dravari had not done in 400 years of conquest history. The emergency session lasted 9 days. First Voice Ron sat through all 9. She had been a diplomat long enough to recognize the specific kind of institutional crisis that happened when a known quantity turned out to be something else entirely. The Concordat had cataloged humanity. They had assessed it. They had placed it neatly in the appropriate administrative tier and attached the appropriate set of recommendations and restrictions, which primarily involved making sure humanity didn't do anything too dramatic before they'd been sufficiently acculturated to galactic norms. Humanity had done something dramatic. The arguments in the chamber broke roughly into 3 camps. The first camp, led by the Veth senior delegation and a coalition of smaller species, held that humanity's actions at what was already being called the Meridian Defense had been extraordinary, but interpretable. One remarkable individual, one extraordinary situation, not necessarily indicative of species-wide capacity. They proposed continuing observation, extended contact protocols, and a gradual reassessment over the next several decades. The second camp, led by a collection of species who had suffered historically at the Dravari's hands and had been watching human military development with barely concealed fervor, held that the Concordat should immediately offer humanity full military alliance status, full technology sharing, and access to the combined strategic archives going back 400,000 years. Their argument was essentially, we have been losing to the Dravari for a very long time, and there is something in this room that apparently knows how to win, and we should talk to it. The third camp was smaller and quieter. 3 species, ancient ones, who had been members of the Concordat since before most of the other species had achieved space travel. They said very little. They asked careful questions. They requested data rather than making speeches. And at the end of the 9th day, when the session had exhausted itself, and the first and second camps were still arguing, the spokesperson for the ancient species, a being called Listener Soth, from a civilization whose name translated approximately as the people who waited, stood and said 3 sentences. We have been watching humanity for 400 years, Soth said. Not 11. 400. The room went quiet. We began watching when they first sent signals out from their world. We have been compiling an observation record since before they left their atmosphere. Soft paused. The people who waited were slow speakers. Their cognitive processes ran deep rather than fast, and their speech reflected this. Every word had been sitting a long time before it was used. We have brought this record to this session because we believe it is material to the assessment of humanity's classification. The record ran to 47,000 pages of observation. It covered 2 centuries of human history from an outside perspective. Wars, economic collapses, famines, disease events that killed hundreds of millions, technological upheavals that rewrote the structure of their society every 2 or 3 generations, a complete collapse of their global financial system, which they appear to have caused themselves through mechanisms that the people who weighted's analysts still didn't fully understand. At least a dozen moments across 4 centuries where the external assessment model had predicted species-level decline and the internal data had instead shown recovery. Adaptation, something that wasn't quite resilience, because resilience implied you bent and came back. This was something else. Humans, under pressure, didn't return to what they'd been before the pressure. They turned into something new. The record contained a case study in what the people who weighted's analysts had labeled, somewhat dryly, the pattern. The pattern recurred throughout the 400 years of observation with the reliability of a mathematical principle. A severe threat appeared. It overwhelmed existing human systems. There was a period, variable in length, sometimes decades, of what looked from the outside like catastrophic failure. Then, inside the failure, a new approach emerged. Not a better version of the old approach. A genuinely new one. One that hadn't existed before the crisis created the conditions for it. The people who waited had initially found this baffling. They had eventually concluded that humanity might be the only species in their observation history for whom catastrophe functioned as a design tool. Listener Soft laid all of this out in the quiet, unhurried way of a species that had never been in a hurry, because they had learned long ago that patience was not a strategy of the weak. It was the strategy of the very, very old. We do not bring this record to the session as a recommendation, Soft said. We bring it as data. The assembly must decide what to do with it. A pause. But we will note for the record that in 400 years of observation, we have identified one characteristic that is present in every significant human achievement and absent in every significant human failure. We believe it is the characteristic responsible for the meridian defense. We believe it is the characteristic that will be relevant to whatever discussion this assembly has about humanity going forward. What characteristic? First voice Ron asked because she had been trained to ask questions, and this was the one that mattered. They believe, Soth said, that something being very difficult is interesting. Silence in the chamber. Not that it can be done. Not that they can do it. They believe, at a cultural level, in the structure of their mythology, in the pattern of their history, that difficult problems are interesting, worth engaging with, worth spending significant resources on, even when the outcome is not guaranteed. Soft folded what passed for hands. Most species, when facing an impossible problem, experience it as the edge of the possible. A wall. They may find ways around the wall. They may attempt to break the wall, but they experience it as a wall. Humans experience it as a door they haven't found the handle for yet. More silence. We thought, Soth said, this was naive. For 2 centuries, we thought it was the charming delusion of a young species that had not yet learned what the galaxy does to naive things. A pause, longer than the others. Then, we watched the meridian defense, and we revised our assessment. The session did not reach a formal consensus that day. The Concordat was too large and too old for quick formal consensus. But there's a shift in the room, the kind of shift that Ron had felt before only once when the Concordat had formally reclassified the Dravari from aggressive expansion civilization to active galactic threat. That reclassification had taken 19 years of wrangling. The informal conversations that evening were suggesting the human reassessment might take 9 months. That was fast. That was unprecedented fast. That was the Concordat moving at a pace that made Ron, sitting in the corridor outside the chamber with cold tea she wasn't drinking, feel that something large was tilting. She was contacted, in that corridor, by a signal she hadn't expected. It came from Admiral Marcus Webb. He was not calling about the Concordat session. He was not supposed to know the details of the session, which was internal Concordat business. He was calling because the Dravari had moved. Not Vosphor. Not at any human system. The Dravari, in the weeks since the Meridian defense, had conducted 3 separate probe operations against Concordat-aligned species on the other side of the Reach. Smaller civilizations, less defended, the kind of harvest operations the Dravari ran as a matter of routine. But the scale was different. The force deployed was heavier than normal for those targets. And the timing, the very specific timing of the operations, all within the same 6-day window, was not routine. They're testing, Webb said, sending probes in force against easier targets to calibrate what the response looks like. They're not done at VOS 4. They pulled back to regroup, not to stop. He paused. They're building a case for a full reassessment operation. Probably a dedicated campaign rather than a harvest mission. Meaning, Ron said, meaning they're going to come back with enough force that one patrol cruiser's shield harmonic calculations don't matter. They're going to come back, try to win a different kind of engagement. He looked at her through the transmission. I need to talk to the Concordat. Formally, not the session, the actual decision makers. I need to talk about what the next phase looks like. What do you believe the next phase looks like? I believe, Webb said carefully, that the Dravari just realized that humanity is a problem that needs to be solved before it gets bigger. I believe we have a window, probably 12 to 18 months before a formal campaign launches, to change the strategic math in a way that makes the math bad for them instead of bad for us. He paused. I believe that window is the whole game. Everything after it gets harder. What would you need? Access, Webb said. Information. The accumulated strategic and tactical knowledge of the Concordats, 400,000 years of conflict with the Dravari. Everything they've tried. Everything that worked. Everything that didn't. Every weakness that's ever been found, exploited, closed. He met her eyes through the screen. You've been fighting them a very long time. I suspect you know things that applied differently by someone thinking about the problem in a different way. You're saying, Ron said slowly, that you want the archives to see what we missed. I'm saying you've been seeing the same problem through the same lens for 400 years. His voice was even, not arrogant, just certain in the specific way that she was coming to understand was a human thing. The certainty of someone who had decided that a difficult problem was interesting. I want to show you a different lens. If we're right about what we see, then you lose nothing and we find something new. If we're wrong, at least we added a data point. Ron sat with this. I'll make the case to the assembly, she said. She did. It was not an easy case. The archives were the Concordats' most guarded asset. Thousands of years of strategic intelligence, tactical records, species profile data, war outcome analyses. They had never been shared outside the Concordats' member species in any meaningful way. There were protections around them that dated back to the founding charter. But Ron made the case. She laid out Webb's argument with the precision and patience of 40 years of diplomatic practice. She laid out the people who weighed its observation record alongside it. She made the argument, the simple, uncomfortable, unavoidable argument, that the Concordat had been fighting the Dravari for 400 years and losing, not in every battle but in the strategic long term, losing ground, losing systems, losing species. The Grade 3 civilization that had just defended a colony with 6 guns had done something in 11 seconds that the Concordats' combined strategic apparatus had not done in 4 centuries. Maybe, she said, with the careful diplomatic understatement of someone who actually meant obviously, maybe the Concordat could stop treating the newcomers like a developmental project and start treating them like an asset. The vote was not unanimous. It was a majority. The archives opened. Commander Sarah Voss had been reassigned by the time the archives opened. She was aboard the Union Victory, a newer, heavier ship, properly crewed, with a weapon system that had been extensively retrofitted following Okafor's analysis of Dravari shield harmonics. She was 3 ranks higher than she had been before the Meridian defense, which she privately thought was the most expensive promotion in human history in terms of what it had cost to receive. She had exactly the same coffee habit and exactly the same tendency to stand at observation windows when she needed to think. She was standing at one now when her new communications officer, a 22-year-old named Prell, sharp enough to have been recruited from the Academy's top 5, nervous enough to still knock on the frame when the door was open, relayed the message from Admiral Webb. Access granted. Concord Archive. Every record the combined galactic community had produced about Dravari strategy, tactics, weaknesses, and history. 400 years of data. Prell read the message summary and added, carefully, the Admiral's note says you have first analysis access. He says, Prell hesitated. He says, and, I'm quoting, find the door. Sarah looked at the stars. 400 years of everyone else's attempts to solve this problem. Every approach that had been tried. Every angle that had been found insufficient. A complete map, essentially, of all the ways the puzzle hadn't been cracked yet. She felt the thing she always felt when a hard problem came into focus. "Tell Lieutenant Okafor to clear her schedule," she said. "And tell Admiral Webb the door's already here. We just need to find a handle." She turned from the window. Three things were true simultaneously in this moment, though Sarah only knew one of them directly. In the Concordat archives, Okafor would find, buried in a sub-index of a tactical analysis from 70 years ago, a notation about Dravari command structure vulnerabilities that had been flagged, studied briefly, and then abandoned because the exploitation method was considered too costly. The cost had been considered too high because it required a kind of military risk tolerance that no Concordat species had demonstrated. In the Dravari Command Assembly, Fleet Admiral Greth was presenting his reclassification case and requesting authorization for a dedicated campaign fleet. He was receiving it. The campaign was being planned for launch in 14 months. The target list included not just VOS-4, but 12 human systems. The plan was not harvest. The plan was elimination. And in the people who weighed its observation archives, 400 years of human data was generating a report that a young analyst had been working on for 6 months and had just finalized. The report's title was clinical and descriptive and said everything it needed to say in 7 words. Humanity, a species that gets better under pressure. Asterisk, the report ran to 11,000 pages. The summary was 3 sentences. They have never faced a threat that made them smaller. They have faced many threats that made them faster. We recommend the Concordat treat this not as a curiosity, but as a strategic resource before someone else does. Asterisk, nobody was sure, reading those 3 sentences, exactly who the someone else was meant to refer to. But the Dravari, planning their campaign in a fleet command room 40 light years away, were about to find out. The war was not coming for humanity. Not anymore. Humanity was coming for the war. The thing nobody had told the Concordat analysts. The thing they found in the archives themselves, buried in a tactical sub-index from a campaign that most of the senior staff had been too young to remember, was that the Dravari had a weakness they had been living with for 2 centuries and had completely stopped seeing. That is the particular danger of old wounds. They become architecture. You stop noticing the scar because it has been there so long it feels like a wall, and walls are supposed to be there. The scar was a vulnerability in their command relay network, a specific point of mechanical dependency built into the deep communication structure of their fleet coordination system in the early days of their expansion, when the technology had been new and the engineers had not fully anticipated how the relay nodes would interact under high-stress combat loading. Under normal operations, the vulnerability was invisible. Under the specific pressure pattern of coordinated multi-point engagement, 4 or more simultaneous attacks on nodes at precise angular separations, the relay network didn't just slow down. It fragmented. Individual ships fell back on local processing, which worked fine for individual ships, but the Dravari's command structure was built around collective fleet intelligence. A fleet that couldn't talk to itself in real time was not one fleet. It was 12 or 40 or 200 individual ships making individual decisions. The Concordat analysts who had found this 70 years ago had noted it with interest and filed it in the archive under theoretical exploitation vectors. High cost. High cost because the exploitation method required hitting 4 precise angular coordinates simultaneously under combat conditions, which required either an impossibly large coordinated force, more than the Concordat had typically been able to field against a Dravari engagement fleet, or an impossibly tight coordination window between smaller forces operating at extreme range. The analysis note, written by a Veth strategist named Third Scholar Neth who had died 40 years ago and left most of her best work in index files nobody had read since, said simply, asterisk, the method is theoretically sound. The required execution tolerance is 0.4 seconds across a 4-point strike. No currently available allied coordination system achieves this consistently under combat conditions. Flag for future review when technology advances. Astra's technology had not advanced. Human technology had. Not because humans were technologically superior. They were not, by most metrics, ahead of the Concordat's best. But they had developed, in their 11 years of active space-based warfare, something that the Concordat had not, a real-time battlefield AI coordination system that had been built specifically for the problem of small forces needing to operate with the precision of large ones. It had been built because humanity had looked at its situation honestly. Small fleet, limited ships, likely to be outgunned in most engagements, and had decided the answer was not to build more ships, but to make the ships they had operate as a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. The system was called Meridian. It was named after the ship. It was named after the ship because the battle analysis team, Okafor, primarily working through the engagement records with the specific intensity of someone who had been on the ship and intended to make sure it mattered, had reverse engineered the principle from the Meridian defense itself. The defense had worked because Sarah Voss had made a set of decisions in sequence with the timing and precision of someone reading an opponent's code rather than fighting a battle. The battle AI was an attempt to institutionalize that, to make what had been the specific genius of one person's thinking into a system that could run across a fleet. It had taken 8 months. It had been tested in simulation 4,000 times. The simulation success rate against Dravari profile opponents was 78%. The number was not comforting, exactly. 22% of the simulations ended badly, in ways that range from significant human losses to catastrophic failure. But 78% was something the Concordat had never achieved against a full Dravari campaign fleet in 400 years of actual combat, and Okafor had pointed this out in her brief to Admiral Webb with the specific flat delivery of someone making a point they find self-evident. Webb had looked at the 78% and the 22% and had made the decision that Sarah would later think of as the most human decision in the history of the war. He had said, "We can improve the 22%. Not the 22% is acceptable. Not we'll live with it." He had said they could improve it, and he had assigned 3 additional teams to find out how, and he had proceeded with the deployment plan simultaneously, because waiting for certainty before acting was not a strategy that tended to work when the enemy was already planning a campaign. Sarah was aboard the Victory when the Dravari campaign fleet dropped out of fold space. They were 14 months into Webb's prediction window, 2 weeks outside Sarah's personal estimate. She had a small, private bet with Okafor, a tradition from the Meridian, where they had made small bets on everything because having something trivial to win or lose made the not-trivial things easier to hold. Okafor owed her coffee. The campaign fleet was enormous. 43 capital ships, 112 strike cruisers, an escort screen that this time was correctly identified as a military formation on first sensor contact, because Okafor had rewritten the classification parameters after the Meridian defense, and the system no longer made the geological survey error. The Dravari had brought every major asset from 3 of their conquest divisions and combined them into a single overwhelming force. It was the largest Dravari fleet deployment in 60 years. It was designed to be unanswerable. Prell read the sensor data to Sarah in a voice that was professionally steady and humanly not, and Sarah watched the numbers resolve on her display and felt the thing she always felt. "Give me Okafor," she said. Okafor's face appeared on the secondary screen. She was in the Tactical Coordination Center 4 decks down, surrounded by 12 other analysts, and the entire interface bank for the Meridian system. She looked the way she always looked before the hard part started, like someone who had run through everything that could go wrong so many times that she had made friends with all of it. "I see them," Okafor said. "I need the relay node map." Running it. A pause of 4 seconds. Nodes identified. For primary relay points. Angular separation within tolerance for the simultaneous strike window. Another pause, shorter. "It's there, Commander. The math works." Sarah looked at 43 capital ships, 112 strike cruisers. She thought about Third Scholar Neth, dead 40 years, leaving a note in an index file that said flag for future review. "Contact Admiral Webb," she said. "Tell him the window is open." What followed was not the kind of battle that gets narrated in real time. It was too large, too complex, too spread across too many ships, and too much space for a single perspective to hold it. Historians would spend decades reconstructing it from recordings and reports and the fragmented recollections of the people who had been inside it. The official name, in UN records, was the Battle of the Orion Reach. In Concordat records, it appeared as the turning engagement. The Dravari, in the after-action reports that survived the battle, called it something that translated approximately as the failure point. What Sarah experienced from the Bridge of the Victory was a sequence of events that the Meridian system tracked, and she responded to, and Okafor narrated, and Prell logged with a voice that got steadier as the battle got worse, and then got steadier still as it started to turn. The first phase was bad. The Dravari were not the same enemy they had been at Voss 4. They had done their own analysis. They had reclassified humanity. They had studied the Meridian defense and identified the specific conditions that had allowed it to succeed, and they had designed their campaign formation to foreclose all of those conditions. Their formation was not a crescent this time. It was a layered box, defensive geometry, no center point to fly into, no single concentration of ships close enough for a 6-gun patrol cruiser trick. They had addressed the problem they understood. The problem was that the problem they'd understood was the old problem. The new problem was the relay nodes. The Meridian system tracked all 12 human ships in the engagement simultaneously, coordinating their movements with a precision that no individual captain could have managed by hand, adjusting approach angles in real time, accounting for the propagation delay in the Dravari fleet's communication, finding the specific 4 angular points that matched the vulnerability profile in Third Scholar Neth's 7-year-old index note. It took 22 minutes to get into position. Those 22 minutes cost 3 ships. Sarah felt each one. Not abstractly, felt it the way you feel something that has a crew and a name, something that was flying 20 minutes ago and wasn't flying now. She registered every loss and filed it in the part of her that would deal with it later, when later came, and kept moving. The 4 angular points aligned. Meridian calculated the execution window. 0.4 seconds. All stations, Sarah said. Her voice was steady. Not performed steadiness. The real kind, the kind that comes from having been genuinely frightened and having gone through it enough times that you've found the thing on the other side of it. Execute relay strike. Coordinated fire. On Meridian. It was not the most dramatic moment she had ever been part of. It was a set of ships firing at specific points at specific times, exactly as planned, in a sequence that looked, from the outside, if you were watching sensor data, like a complicated geometric pattern of light. Then, the Dravari fleet stopped talking to itself, and, for the first time in 4 centuries of conquest, the most powerful military force the Dravari had ever assembled in a single operational theater did not know what to do next. Because they were built to fight as a collective. They were built to coordinate. Their doctrine, their formation geometry, their command structure, their training, all of it assumed they would be able to communicate with each other in real time. Without the relay network, they defaulted to local command authority, which meant 43 capital ships and 112 strike cruisers, all doing slightly different things based on what each local commander could see from their own position. And what the local commanders saw from their own positions was not what was actually happening, because Meridian was still talking to all 12 human ships. The human fleet wasn't 12 individual ships in that moment. It was one organism with 12 moving parts, operating on information that the Dravari fleet couldn't coordinate fast enough to respond to. It pressed the angular gaps that opened between Dravari ships that weren't communicating. It identified the capital ships that had shifted formation in ways that put them momentarily outside protective range. It found, in the chaos of a fleet that had lost its coordination, 47 seconds of specific vulnerability in a cluster of 6 strike cruisers, and used all 12 human ships against that cluster simultaneously. The cluster was gone in 51 seconds. The Dravari local commanders saw it happen. They could not coordinate a response fast enough. They tried. They were not bad commanders. They were veteran, capable officers who had run hundreds of engagements. But they were running individual ships against an integrated intelligence, and it was like trying to catch water with open hands. The battle lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Human losses, 7 ships. Among the 342 crew of those ships, 281 dead. Sarah would learn each name later. She would learn them the way you learn names that matter, the way you carry them. Dravari losses, 11 capital ships destroyed, 23 heavily damaged and unable to fold, 41 strike cruisers gone. The remaining fleet, partially regrouped once the relay network came partially back online, made the full calculation that the Meridian system had already anticipated they would make, which was retreat, but not full retreat. They folded to a holding position 4 light hours out. They were still there. They were not gone. They were damaged and regrouped and still significantly larger than what remained of the human response fleet, And Sarah sat on the bridge of the Victory and looked at the tactical display and understood what she was looking at. The battle was over. The war was not. She contacted Admiral Webb. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. He had been monitoring the engagement in real time. He knew the losses. He knew the Dravari's current position. You held, he said. We held, she said. They're at 4 light hours. They're not done. No, he agreed. They're not done. He was quiet for a moment. But they're different. They went into this knowing we were a threat. They planned for the threat they knew about. They planned for the Meridian defense. His voice was even and considered the voice of someone who had been thinking about this for 14 months. They didn't plan for what you just did to them. That's 2 times now they've walked into a different problem than the one they prepared for. They'll prepare for this one, Sarah said. They will, Webb agreed. And we'll find the next one. He looked at her steadily through the screen. That's the game, Sarah. We have to be finding the next thing faster than they can prepare for the current one. The moment we stop moving, we're back to being a grade 3 civilization. She understood what he was saying. She looked at the display. The Dravari holding position. For light hours of space between the 2 damaged fleets. I need more information on their next-tier command structure, she said. After the relay failure, the local commanders had to make individual decisions. I want to know how those decisions are made, what authority they have, what they're not allowed to do without command authorization. She paused. If we understand that, we know what they can't do when they're isolated. And if we know what they can't do, we know how to isolate them again, Webb said. Better, Sarah said. We know how to make the isolation permanent. Webb looked at her. Say what you mean, he said, because he had been working with her long enough to know when she was on the edge of something. The relay network, she said. We took it down for 4 hours. Well, we took it down for good. Not in one engagement, systematically. Every relay node in their active operational theater, mapped and targeted, removed over a campaign that runs across multiple engagements. Stripped the Dravari fleet of its ability to coordinate on a structural level, not just in a single battle. She paused. They built the network 2 centuries ago. They've been maintaining it because they've never had a fight without it. They may not be able to fight without it. The silence on Webb's end was not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of someone doing the math. That's a full strategic campaign, he said. Not a battle, not a defense operation. A multi-theater offensive targeting their military infrastructure directly. Yes, she said. That's not what the Earth Council authorized. No, she said. It's not. She looked at him. You said we have to keep finding the next problem faster than they can prepare for the current one. This is the next problem. A pause. We're 11 years old by galactic standards. They've been doing this for 400. The only way to stop them from eventually building a fleet big enough to come back and finish this properly is to change the nature of the fight. Not win battles. Change what the fight is about. Webb sat with this for a long moment. Outside his window, in the Union command station on Earth orbit, Sarah could see the blue curve of the planet below him. Blue and green and white. Very small from space. Very specific. The kind of thing that, once you had seen it from far enough away, made everything else feel consequential in a particular way. I'll take it to the Council, Webb said. And to the Concordat. If we're going to run a campaign like this, we need the Concordat's strategic support. First voice Ron, Sarah said. She'll be the first call. He paused. She's been waiting for us to say something like this. I think she knows we're the only ones who'd say it. Soha no did. Webb, she said. Commander. The 7 ships. She didn't need to specify which 7. I want their names. I know, he said. You'll have them. A pause. Soha, what you did today, what you all did, not done yet, she said. She ended the transmission. Okafor appeared at the door of the bridge. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one on the console beside Sarah without comment. They stood together for a moment looking at the display, the Dravari holding position, the remnant human fleet, the space between them. The Meridian system flagged 37 engagement insights from the battle data. Okafor said, I want to start the analysis before the data context fades. When do you sleep? Later, Okafor said. Later, Sarah agreed. They drank the coffee. Outside the window, the stars held their positions, indifferent as always to everything happening in front of them. The Dravari fleet sat 4 light hours away, doing the same thing any damaged army does after an unexpected reversal. Thinking, reassessing, trying to understand what had just happened to them. That window of thinking was the most valuable thing in the galaxy right now. And humanity, for the first time in 11 years of galactic contact, was going to use it to go on offense. Not just defending what they had, going to take something back. The war was changing. It just didn't know it yet. History, when it is being made, does not feel like history. It feels like decisions. Small ones and large ones, made by tired people in rooms with cold coffee and bad light, under pressure that hasn't gone away, with incomplete information and imperfect choices, and the specific weight of knowing that whatever you decide is going to matter in ways you can't entirely see yet. It feels like that. It doesn't feel like a turning point until you're on the other side of it and someone is writing the turning point down. The decision to launch a strategic offensive against Dravari military infrastructure was not made in a dramatic room with sweeping music and inspirational speeches. It was made in 3 separate rooms on 3 separate days, with significant argument, considerable uncertainty, and at least one moment, documented in Admiral Webb's personal log, which he never intended to be declassified, when the Earth Council senior representative had said, "This is too much, too fast," and Webb had sat very still for 30 seconds before saying, "I understand, and we do not have the luxury of slow." And then the representative had sat very still for 30 seconds. And then the decision had moved forward. First Voice Ron made the case to the Concordat Assembly in 7 hours of formal session. She made it the way she made all her best arguments, not by being louder than the room or more certain than the evidence allowed, but by being more honest than people expected. She told the Assembly, plainly, that the Dravari had come with their largest fleet deployment in 60 years and had been stopped by a species that had been in open space for 11 years. She said this not as a triumph, but as an analysis. She said, if that is what 11 years produced, what does the strategic picture look like in 20 years, 30, 50? And what does it look like for the Dravari when they realize this trajectory? She said, the Dravari's next move will not be another campaign fleet. Their next move, if we give them the time to make it, will be something large enough that the math changes back. And she said, this is the window. Not next year's window. This window, the one we are standing in right now. The vote was not as close as the previous one. The resources the Concordat committed were not unlimited. They were significant. Tactical intelligence, relay node mapping data, strategic coordination support, 3 Veth warships that had been sitting in a defensive posture for 20 years under the command of a general named Trev Sath who had been waiting her entire career for someone to say the thing that Ron had just said. Trev Sath arrived at the Human Fleet Coordination Station 12 days after the Battle of the Orion Reach with her 3 ships and a data package that contained 40 years of personally compiled Dravari relay network observation, and said to Commander Sarah Voss, in the flat tone of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything, I have been watching their infrastructure for 4 decades. I have never had anyone to give this to who knew what to do with it. Tell me what you need. Sarah said, everything. The campaign that followed ran for 9 months. 9 months is not long in galactic terms. The Dravari's 400-year expansion had been built on operations that ran for decades. The people who waited had conducted observation programs that lasted centuries. 9 months was, by the standards of the galaxy, barely enough time to properly convene a working group and write the agenda. In 9 months, humanity and its Concordat partners systematically dismantled the Dravari relay network across 4 operational theaters. Not quickly, not cleanly, not without cost. The relay node campaign was the hardest sustained military operation humanity had run since it reached space. Each node was defended. Each defense had to be analyzed, the vulnerability found, the approach calculated, the execution run by the Meridian system against real opponents who were learning from each engagement and adjusting. The first 3 node operations cost more than Sarah had hoped. She revised her estimates. She revised them again. She told Webb, in a transmission after the 4th operation, that she was 90% confident in the strategic outcome and would never be 100% confident in anything. And Webb had said, 90 is fine, keep going. She kept going. Okafor barely slept for 9 months. The analysis team barely slept for 9 months. Prell, who had been promoted twice in the course of the campaign and had developed the kind of calm precision under pressure that you cannot train and can only develop by living through it enough times, logged the entire campaign with a thoroughness that would make him, years later, the primary source for 3 separate historical accounts. The relay network did not fall all at once. It fell the way complex systems fall, in sequence, each lost node increasing the pressure on adjacent ones, each gap in coverage creating a coordination problem that the remaining nodes couldn't fully compensate for. The Dravari repaired what they could. They adapted what they could adapt. They were not helpless. They were ancient and experienced and deeply resourced, and they fought for every node with everything they had, and they won some of those fights. But the trajectory was set. By the 6th month, the Dravari's operational capacity in the Orion Reach Theater had dropped to 60% of pre-campaign levels. By the 8th month, it was at 40. By the 9th, the message arrived at the Union Command Station on day 273 of the campaign. It arrived on a Dravari diplomatic frequency that had not been used in active communication in 60 years. The frequency was the one designated, in ancient Dravari military protocol, for formal inter-command communication outside of combat contexts. Using it was a specific choice, a choice with meaning. In Dravari culture, that their diplomatic analysts had to explain to Admiral Webb's staff in a briefing that lasted 2 hours. The meaning was this: the Dravari Command Assembly was not surrendering. That was not the word. That was not a concept their culture handled in the way the word implied. What they were doing was something their diplomatic protocol called recognizing a state of tactical complexity, an acknowledgement that the current conflict had reached a level of difficulty that made continued unilateral action strategically unsound. It was essentially the Dravari way of saying, we need to talk. Webb brought Sarah into the response planning. He brought First Voice Ron in. He brought listener Soth of the people who waited, who had been quietly observing the campaign's progress with the particular quality of attention that very old beings bring to things they have been waiting to see for a very long time. He brought Trev Sath, who had spent 40 years preparing for a conversation she had never expected anyone to actually open. He brought them all together in a room on the command station, and he said, they want to talk. Tell me what talking looks like. The room worked on that question for 3 days. The answer they arrived at was not simple. It was layered, conditional, built on specific parameters that the Concordats' accumulated diplomatic knowledge informed and humanity's specific tactical position defined. It was the product of 400,000 years of galactic political theory and 11 years of human stubbornness operating in the same space at the same time, and it was, First Voice Ron would say later, the most interesting document she had ever helped write. The core of it was this: no harvest operations in human or Concordat-aligned space. Formal recognition of human territorial sovereignty. A mutual non-aggression framework with specific verification protocols. And the piece that was humanity's specific contribution, the piece that had not come from the Concordats' accumulated diplomatic wisdom, but from a conversation between Sarah Voss and Admiral Webb at 2 in the morning over coffee that was definitely not good. A provision that required the Dravari to participate in a joint strategic communication council with Concordat and human representatives. Not peace exactly, not alliance. Something more uncomfortable and more honest than either. Accountability. The Dravari negotiators sat with the proposal for 11 days. They came back with objections, revisions, counterproposals. The negotiation ran for 3 months, which was, by Concordat standards, essentially instantaneous. Ron managed the formal sessions. She was very good at it. She had been doing it for 40 years, and she was doing it now with the specific quality of presence she reserved for negotiations that felt like they were rewriting something large. Sarah was not in the negotiating room. She was not a diplomat. She was in command of a fleet that was maintaining a defensive posture in the Orion Reach, because maintaining a defensive posture, being visibly present, visibly capable, visibly not going anywhere, was its own form of diplomatic communication, and Sarah understood this instinctively even if she would not have described it in those terms. She received the agreement text 3 hours before it was formally signed. She read it in the secondary observation bay of the Victory, which had become, over the 9 months of the campaign, the place she went to think about everything that mattered. The window was the same. The stars were the same. She read the agreement and thought about Vosphor. 14,000 people who were still there, still farming, still building, the colony that had grown by 3,000 since the Meridian defense, because the news of what had happened had, counterintuitively, encouraged immigration rather than discouraging it. Humans went toward things that had been dangerous and survived. She thought about the 2 capital ships she had gutted with 6 guns and 1 lieutenant's 4 years of calculations. She thought about Third Scholar Neth, dead 40 years, who had written a note that nobody had acted on for 70 years and which had ultimately changed the course of a war. She thought about Okafor, currently asleep for the first time in what felt like weeks for decks below. Prell knocked on the frame of the open door. He always knocked. She had decided she would not make him stop. The agreement has been signed, he said. Admiral Webb is requesting your presence on the command station for the formal announcement. Tell him I'll be there in an hour." Prell nodded and started to leave. "Prell," she said. He stopped. "Do you know what the Veth called a moment of storm turns?" He thought about it. He had been serving on a joint species ship long enough to pick up Veth idioms. "The weather decides," he said. "Right." She looked at the stars. "Write that in the log. Today. That's what today is." She paused. "The weather decided." He wrote it. She stood at the window for a few more minutes. The Concordat Assembly convened the following week for the formal integration session, the session that would, on record, mark humanity's official transition from monitored emerging species to full strategic partner. It was the first time in the Concordat's history that the transition had happened inside a single decade. The standard process took a minimum of 300 years. Listener Soth attended the session and said nothing, which was unusual. Soth had spoken at every significant session for 60 years. When the presiding officer asked Soth if the people who waited wished to make a statement for the record, Soth was quiet for a long time. Long enough that some of the delegates shifted in their seats. Then, Soth said, "We watched them for 400 years. We watched them before they left their world. We watched them face famines and wars and plagues and every category of catastrophe their world could produce. We watched them lose many times. We watched them lose badly. We compiled, across 4 centuries, the most detailed observation record of any pre-galactic species in our archive." Another pause. "We thought for 200 of those years that they would be a case study in extinction. They came close enough several times that we prepared the file for archival." Soth's voice did not carry emotion in the way most galactic species voices did, but there was a quality in it, a quality of weight, that the room heard. "We were wrong about what we were watching. We thought we were watching a species that survived despite its nature. We now understand that we were watching a species that survived because of it." The presiding officer asked Soth to elaborate. "Their nature," Soth said, "is to be interested in the thing that is trying to kill them, to find it more interesting than frightening, to go toward it rather than away. It is not bravery. Bravery is a response to fear. What humans have is not a response. It is a default orientation. The universe, for them, is a large and interesting problem." A very long pause. "We have been in space for a very long time. We have met many species. We have never met anything like this before. We recommend the Concordat record, formally and explicitly, that what humanity brings to galactic civilization is not primarily their technology or their military capacity, though both are significant. It is the quality of their attention. They pay attention to problems in a way that changes the problems." The session approved the formal transition unanimously. First voice Ron, standing outside the chamber afterwards, with a cup of tea that was actually warm for once, was contacted by Admiral Webb. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. His voice had a quality she'd heard in it before. The specific quality of someone who had been carrying a weight for a long time and had not yet fully registered that it was lighter. "What comes next?" she asked. "More problems," he said without hesitation and with something in his voice that was not quite a smile and was not quite not. "The Dravari aren't the only threat in the Reach. The silence hasn't been quiet in the outer systems. And there are 3 or 4 things in the archives that the Concordat cataloged as dormant that I'd like to have a conversation about." "The ancient machine minds," she said. "The ancient machine minds," he confirmed. "They've been dormant for 60,000 years. And you want to know why they went dormant," she said. "I want to know what woke up," he said. "Ron, process this. You realize," she said, "that you have been a galactic species for 11 years, and you're already looking at 60,000-year-old dormant machine intelligences and finding them interesting." "Fascinating, actually," Webb said. She set down her tea. She thought about the Veth word, Kaeldrath, the word for the moment you understood the thing hunting you was never afraid. She thought about what she'd told her assistant 9 months ago, that she needed a translation for the human concept of courtesy as offered by a damaged patrol cruiser to a fleet that was still pointing guns at it. She still didn't have a perfect translation for that. But, she thought, standing in the corridor outside the chamber, where humanity had just been formally recognized as a full partner in the oldest civilization collective in the galaxy, that she was beginning to understand the shape of it. It wasn't naivete. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't even confidence, exactly, though it looked like confidence from the outside. It was something simpler and stranger. It was a species that had spent 200,000 years at the bottom of a food chain, that had been prey and cold and starving and sick and frightened, that had lost more than any species should be able to lose and still be standing, and had come out of all of it not hardened, not closed, not smaller, curious. The ancient machine minds of the Silence had been dormant for 60,000 years. They were, according to the Concordat's oldest records, the most powerful artificial intelligences ever constructed by any species in a mapped galaxy. Their last known active period had ended in what the record described as self-imposed cessation following a threat assessment that indicated continued existence was strategically untenable, which meant, translated, they had looked at something 60,000 years ago and decided the odds were not survivable and gone dark. Something had changed. The first anomalous signal from the outer systems had been logged 4 months ago. Small, easy to miss. Okafor had flagged it in the battle data analysis, buried under 17 more urgent items, and Sarah had moved it to a secondary queue and then forgotten it until Webb mentioned the Silence, and she had pulled the queue, and there it was. 4 months ago, she pulled Okafor out of a sleep she had been in for 12 hours. Okafor, to her eternal credit, processed this in approximately 8 seconds, said, "Oh," in the specific tone that means considerably more than the word contains, and pulled up the analysis. "It's not a system malfunction," Okafor said. "I thought it was a sensor artifact. I logged it to secondary." She paused. "I was wrong. You flagged it," Sarah said. "That's why it's in the queue. I flagged it as a maybe." Okafor pulled up the full signal profile. It matches known Silence communication architecture at about 63% correlation. The other 37% is, she stopped. "What? New?" Okafor said. "The other 37% is communication architecture I don't have a profile for in any database. It's not Dravari. It's not Concordat. It's not human. It's not anything in the archives." She looked at Sarah. Whatever woke them up, they may not have woken up alone. Silence of the room. The particular silence that falls when a new shape of problem becomes visible for the first time. Sarah Voss, 30 years old, commander of the Union Victory, veteran of the Meridian Defense and the Orion Reach, and 9 months of Relay Node campaign, who had once flown a 6-gun patrol cruiser directly into 14 capital ships and survived, who had changed the classification of her species twice in the same decade, who had a habit of standing at observation windows and drinking coffee that was almost always cold, felt the thing she always felt. She was interested. The galaxy, in this moment, was turning in the way galaxies turn when something that has been sleeping for a very long time opens its eyes and finds something looking back at it that wasn't there before. 60,000 years ago, the Silence had looked at the galaxy and decided the odds were not survivable. They had not, in those 60,000 years, encountered humanity. They had not yet had the experience, bewildering, disorienting, fundamental, of looking at a species and realizing that what should be fear was reading as curiosity. What should be retreat was reading as approach. What should be a prey response was reading, somehow, as a welcome. The galaxy had a new variable. It was small and strange and had been in open space for 11 years, and it was already looking at the oldest, most dangerous mystery in the outer systems and finding it interesting. What the Silence would make of this, nobody yet knew. But the Concordat's most senior diplomat was updating her classification files, and one Veth analyst, in a late-night archive session, was adding a final note to the document she'd been maintaining since the Meridian Defense. Next to the invented word Kelvrith, the thing that was prey, that forgot, she wrote a second word. Also invented. Also grammatically irregular. Also not yet in any dictionary. It meant, approximately, the thing that the universe watches when it wants to understand what comes next. She labeled the document as ongoing. She suspected it would be ongoing for a very long time. The weather had decided, and somewhere in the cold dark of the outer systems, 60,000 years of silence was listening to the sound of a species that had never learned to be afraid of silence, getting louder,